Good morning, welcome Divanauts to Cronista de Indias, the YouTube channel dedicated to Latin American studies with yours truly, Professor Andrea Lorena Fernandez from Pace University and Baruch College in New York City. In the last episode, we concluded the first unit of Latin American divas titled Barroco de Indias with Antonio or Catalina de Rauso, the Virago conquistador, whom today we would say the transgender conquistador, but we use the period terminology. Check out the previous episode to learn more about this wonderful character. The second unit of the course, Latin American Divas, is dedicated to the 19th century and is titled Soberanas Repúblicas, or Sovereign Nations. The unit consists of roughly the following historical periods: 1800 to 1830. This is the thick of the Revolutionary Wars, led by very famous characters like Simón Bolívar, yay Venezuelans, José de San Martín, Antonio Nariño, and José Antonio Páez, another Venezuelan, by the way. We played a big role, just so you know. All of those illustrious enlightened gentlemen who signed documents, created manifestos, and participated in war to make believe that they made history on their own. So they conveniently forgot the colored masses that assisted their plight for independence. Um, this period is also characterized by a brief relaxation in gender expectations for women because in times of war, social norms may go out the window. So there was a brief period of time in which it was okay for middle and upper class women to go outside alone because they were assisting their men in the revolutionary effort. The second part of the Soberanas Repúblicas unit is from 1830 to 1900, and I like to call this period the Age of Caudillos, or the Age of Strongmen. We will get more on caudillos later, but they create the motivation behind industrialization and they regendered the nation. They want the women to go back into the home after a brief period of laxity. It was a backlash against that little period. This particular episode, episode 10, titled Soberanas Repúblicas, addresses the political, racial, cultural, economic motivations behind Latin American independence movements from 1800 and 1830. We will talk about 1, the Bourbon reforms, 2, women's roles in the Revolutionary War, and 3, the next 4 episodes will discuss 4 women who participated in Latin American revolutions. The thick of the patriot versus royalist conflicts. We're going to pick them and we're going to focus on them. And see at the end of the episode to learn about who these 4 revolucionarias are for the season. So let's go to the Bourbon reforms. This section has 5 sections. 1, why die for independence from Spain? 2, what is enlightened despotism? 3, how did they reform existing political and economic structures? 4, what does race and class have to do with independence in Latin America? And 5, the results. So why die for independence from Spain? The House of Bourbon was composed of 3 kings. They were actually French. So they were Philip of Anjou, the Philip V, Ferdinand VII, and Charles III. And they considered themselves enlightened despots. They allowed into Spain publications and materials from the French Revolution and from the Industrial Revolution, but with censorship so that people would not get crazy ideas like, I don't know, decapitate the queen, or because she likes cake instead of bread, whatever. So in Spain, enlightened despotism had the following results. They created industry, things like textile factories and technical education, but nobody eats textiles and nobody eats crystal making, like glass making fancy vases things. So in the industrialization in Spain was limited to the upper classes. It didn't trickle down. Prosperous agriculture, farming was actually abandoned towards the 19th century. People couldn't find jobs in farming, so they moved into the city and overcrowded those, but unfortunately the food supply decreased because of it. We continued trade and shipbuilding. That's not going to stop for the next 50 or so years. And the Bourbon reforms never got to the root of the feudal problem that characterized Spain, particularly its nobility's monopoly on land and the antiquated agricultural methods that did not produce enough food for that growing, industrializing population. In the Americas, the story is slightly different. We actually get a revival of commerce because it reduces smuggling, meaning pirates. If you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean, the Bourbon reforms were supposed to fix that issue. We improve the administration of the colonies. We create 4 viceroyalties where there previously had been 2. The 2 original ones were New New Spain in present-day Mexico, and Lima in South America. They controlled, so respectively, Central and North America, and then South America for the Lima crowd. Um, to protect the Caribbean coast, they create new and the Atlantic coast, they create new viceroyalties. The Decree of Free Trade in 1778 finally allowed colonies to trade with each other instead of sending supplies to Spain and waiting for 5 months for them to return. So it made economic sense to expedite trade by also reducing duty tax. The reforms also changed existing political and economic structures. It decentralized Latin America. So the two new viceroyalties are Nueva Granada in present-day Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. They happened in 1739 to protect the Caribbean coast from English, French, and Dutch pirates or incursions. The viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was also created to decrease contraband in 1776, same birthday as the United States, so it's easy to remember. And they benefited from the Free Trade Decree of 1778 that permitted intercolonial exchanges. Today's map of South America mostly follows the viceroyalties, and countries in former viceroyalties have historical, cultural, and even linguistic traits in common, more so than the next viceroyalty. So the folks from Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, we have the same dad, Simón Bolívar, who is not the same dad as the crowd in Chile. So that will be Bernardo O'Higgins. That's their dad. The economic boost brought about by the Bourbon reforms actually gave the upper middle and upper classes a taste for the bourgeoisie's freedom, economic freedom. It encouraged regional specialization, increase in population, and emergent consciousness as working class. And that regional specialization will come to haunt us later because we specialize too much and can't diversify our economy. So Argentina, you and beef in the 19th century are awesome, but when everybody else has beef, you have a terrible economy, Argentina. I'm sorry for you. Okay, so some of the results, as I said, were popular revolts in the 1780s that preceded independence because the beneficiaries of the Bourbon reforms were still the Spanish and Creole landowners, mine owners, and merchants. So the rest of the population had no choice but to revolt. And that was a catalyst and a precursor to the actual revolutions. Creoles resented exclusion from the higher offices. So to get a post as a bishop, for example, you had to be born in Spain. So if you're a nice, well-educated Creole gentleman and you want the fancy job, tough luck. You can't have it. You're not Spanish. So interracial dislike for one another is a catalyst for the revolutions. Racial categories became even more ambiguous during the Enlightenment. In fact, we have this trend of casta paintings in which they put different types of interracial marriages into slots, and they have like 16 slots. And the first one will be Español y Español gets Español. But then towards the middle, you get Coyote, and Pardo gets you a Chino. So they have, I don't know how you get a Chinese person in Latin America, but apparently you do. From all of these varieties of Indian Black and Spanish. So people were becoming Bejer and Bejer, and the anxiety over not being able to tell people apart actually assists in the revolution because race no longer visibly or economically justifies social differences of class within our communities. Increased social mobility also encouraged the revolution. Fortunate landowner class families sought to marry their daughters to the white elite. And pardos, free mulattoes, or freed folks of African descent, under Charles III could buy their whiteness with cédulas de gracias al sacar to free them from the status of being infamous. So you could actually buy a certificate that said that you were white enough to officialize yourself in front of society. Colonial elites sometimes resisted racial mix-ins, sometimes litigating their children's marriages if children married without permission, which was rare but possible. Class structure remained rigid. The landowning elite, the old landowning elite, challenged the growing wealth of merchant classes. So that's another tension. Merchants and wealthy landowners don't like each other because they compete with money. The merchant class tended to be of immigrant Spanish origins, though they were newly arrived, and they would invest their capital in haciendas or land to safeguard against financial loss. So they were competing with real estate as well. And they diversified their income. So if they had a terrible crop, the merchants could actually front their businesses for the next few months, whereas landowners were stuck with a terrible harvest. So there was also a wave of migration from Spain to Latin America in the 18th century. And because of the discrimination against American born Spaniards, the newly arrived people could be a pig farmer in Spain, and then they arrived in America and take the job of somebody who is college educated. So they saw them as gachupines or chapetones who disdain manual labor and could not withstand the weather and limited their criollos employment. So the results of the Bourbon reforms were two. One, intellectual renovations of the colonies, and two, populist rebellions. The first one, the intellectual renovation of the colonies happened through the promotion of useful knowledge, discussions of free trade, and the rights of man. Now, documents like the Rights of Man and the Declarations for the independence in the United States were censored. It was actually illegal to possess them in Latin America, but that did not mean that people did not share these documents clandestinely. In fact, Antonio Nariño, uh, father of the independence movement in Colombia, translates the Rights of Man before it gets hot and ends up in prison for a number of years. I don't know how many, like 13 years, in a horrible prison in Cartagena for translating these documents. But that did not mean that people didn't like them. To think of themselves as equal and all men are created equal. That sounds really appealing. Two, it causes populist rebellions. The centralization of the colonial government, modernization of local economies, and Indians, blacks, and mestizos who did not reap the benefits of the Bourbon reforms create more resentment, and you get populist rebellions. So, what are women's roles in the Revolutionary War? This is part two of the episode. What about las revolucionarias? So, the traditional story comes that up to this point excludes women. Yet, it um, Benjamin Keene's Latin American History and Latin American Civilization, the classic textbooks that we used to teach Latin American history at CUNY and New York City or at Pace, they exclude the role of women. So to get into it, we have to use specialized textbooks or even come up with our own textbook. During the Independence War from 1810 to 1830s, women were indispensable to the patriot and royalist forces alike. They helped in separatist conspiracies. They participated in Hispanophobic propaganda. They provided logistical support for armies like intelligence, arms trafficking, cooking, sewing, tending to the sick or injured, and even in combat. Recruiting or seducing men for the Spanish army or to the patriot forces on both sides was actually another job for the women. And espionage. Now, in the Viceroyalty of New Granada, we call the revolucionarias, we call them Juanas. So if you were a lady that participated in the war, whether even if you didn't see combat but you were still assisting, people would have called you a Juana, so they will not use your actual name to protect your identity. So why the exclusion from history if their role was so massive and important? Women developed new political consciousness during the Revolutionary War, and afterwards the backlash was to put them back into the kitchen, so they were discouraged from having these new traits of agency. Post-independence government feared women's involvement in the war might encourage them to subvert traditional gender roles, so they create this dichotomy for patriotism. The female heroes get to be martyrs and passive symbols. So if you go and walk around the city in Latin America and you look for female heroes in popular and public monuments, you're going to find things like flowers and plaques and birds and things that represent nature. Whereas the male heroes, they get to be depicted in popular culture as warriors and active patriots. I dare you to walk through a single city in South America and not bump into a sculpture of Simon Bolivar on his damn horse. Absolutely. But His lover, confidant, and savior, Manuela Saénz in Caracas, gets a rose next to her monument. So it shows you the dichotomy. The women are allowed to be passive symbols, whereas the men are active symbols. And that regenders the nation. Juanas. So what are the characteristics of the Juana? So we're going to read from Pamela S. Murray's Women and Gender in Modern Latin America, Historical Sources and Interpretations. Really, really good textbook. And we're going to use chapter 1 right here, titled Engendering the Era of Latin American Independence, 1810 to 1820s. So in the years after 1814, as anti-Spanish feelings spread and the fighting intensified, the independence wars mobilized increasing numbers of ordinary people, women included. Indeed, these years saw a widening of opportunities for female participation in the Patriot War effort. Women of all classes, including many of mixed race or African descent, increasingly served the cause in various capacities, acting as spies, messengers, and arms traffickers, as well as cooks, nurses, and suppliers of all kinds of goods and services to the Patriot Army. Those who became camp followers, or Juanas, in Colombia and Venezuela, or Rabonas in Peru, helped ensure basic survival of ordinary soldiers. In the fiercely contested territory of northern South America, local women, often in collaboration with patriot guerrillas, organized grassroots and community campaigns of resistance to the Spanish. This was the case, for example, of Antonia Santos and other women of the small Colombian city of Socorro. One of the most dangerous roles played by women within the Patriot War effort was that of recruiter for the insurgent army. The job entailed persuading soldiers, sometimes an entire garrison in Spanish royal army, to switch loyalties and to desert the Spanish and join the opponents. Authorities referred to this recruitment strategy as seduction. So they're using the Eve trope, the seducing, given the apple thing. Beyond being given suggestive Beyond being suggestive of the charm and boldness that many a recruiter must have possessed, the term evokes a gendered lens through which authorities viewed the conflict and their enemy in particular. In their eyes, after all, the insurgents were unfaithful subjects whose betrayal of their absolute monarch was not unlike an unfaithful wife's betrayal of her husband. Both were, at bottom, acts of insubordination. Threats to patriarchal honor and good order. So they saw women participating in patriots and seducing royalist soldiers into the patriot ranks as women as seduction. They saw it as a marriage, like a husband or a wife cheating on the partner. Neither was to be tolerated. The effectiveness of seduction as a patriot strategy, moreover, may be gauged in part by the extent to which it worried the Spanish, especially those in charge of the counterinsurgency. As we learn from the first primary source reading below, Royal Army commanders reserved their harshest punishments for it, so the women seducers were more harshly punished than other insurgents. Historian Barry Robinson, in a recent study of female insurgents in New Spain, Mexico, notes that such officials, quote, feared women's ability to influence the course of the Spanish war effort, unquote, and they thus, quote, imposed harsher penalties for the crime of seduction of royal troops than for any other political crime committed by women, with the exception of women who carried arms or led troops into battle, unquote. So, let's summarize. What are the characteristics of a Juana or a Rabona? You're going to engage in contraband with weapons, men, and alcohol, all necessary for the war. Number two, it's going to be a family affairs. Oftentimes, you're going to assist male kin on either the patriot or the royalist side. 3, intelligence. You're going to capitalize on social invisibility. And that's going to enable you to gather intelligence and pass it to the men in your family. Because you can walk around with a veil and nobody will recognize you. Oh, what do you know? Not being seen is actually useful. 4, we already mentioned seduction, and this involves the night, alcohol, and desertion, and a lot of charisma on behalf of the Juana. 5, supporting the troops, actual fighting as healers, administrators, and negotiators in the front lines. notable examples. So here are the 4 heroines that we're going to study as Juanas. Notable examples right here on the next 4 episodes of Cronista de Indias are going to be Policarpa Salavarrieta. I know, even she couldn't deal with that name. Uh, Colombians endearingly call her La Pola for short, and I'm very thankful for that because my English-speaking students would have a lot of trouble spelling out Policarpa Salavarrieta, so they simply go with La Pola. And La Pola is a Colombian working-class girl, maybe a mestiza, maybe a criolla, it doesn't really matter at this point, but she's a seamstress by day and a spy by night. The second lady is Carmen Camacho, a Mexican mestiza who is tried for seducing the troops. So we're going to actually look at a court case and how you went about trying and executing or even punishing a seducer. 3, Angela Batallas. We don't even know if that's her name, but if your name is the Angel of Battle, you gotta be pretty damn cool. So Angela Batallas is a Colombian slave woman who harnesses the legal system to obtain freedom from the caudillo, from Simón Bolívar. So she is illiterate, but is clever and brave and approaches the leader of the revolution of the Patriot Army saying, here's my loyalty for the independence movement, but in return, I want to be a free woman. We'll see her story as we come along. The last girl that we're going to study is Manuela Saénz. She's probably one of the most famous, born in Ecuador, but she falls in love with Simón Bolívar when he's passing by. She's married. It's a wonderful story. Sounds like a telenovela. She is posthumously titled Generala of the revolutionary forces. She is, as I said, Simón Bolívar's confidant, lover, rescuer, and dame of honor to the Chavista historical revisionism. So we'll talk more about Chavista historical revisionism later. So in this episode, episode 10 of Latin American Divas, we reviewed the motivations behind the independence movement, and we included the agency of women, or Juanas, in our nation's birthdays. We talked about contraband, family affairs, intelligence, seduction, and supporting the troops in active combat as the main characteristics of these Juanas. The next chapter of this course is dedicated to Policarpa Salavarrieta. Or maybe it was Apollonia Salavarrieta. Or maybe it was La Pola. Or it doesn't matter. When you're a spy, I guess, you need as many names as you possibly can have. The heroine could very well be considered Colombia's founding mother, and yet very little is known about her in the English-speaking world. Pola, by the way, is my Starbucks name. That's what I give them on the cup thing, so that nobody knows that my real name is Andrea. I just want to grow up to be like La Pola. That's just my dream. Okay. Latinos welcomed La Pola into their homes in 2010 with a critically acclaimed telenovela by RCN Colombia, also titled La Pola, Amar la hizo libre, or Loving Made Her Free. Join us next time so we can pack this bundle of creative liberty and joy with the telenovela and La Pola's actual history. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about Latin American divas right here with Cronista de Indias, where new episodes drop every Friday. Please hit that subscribe button so you may never miss an episode. And as always, a million thanks for viewing, sharing, and liking the episodes. Like the poster said, it's our motto, do epic shit.